But what about my life? I have a right to life. What property do I have associated with my right to life? My physical body. My body may not be much, but it's mine. I own this body. I decide what food I will eat. I decide whether I drink alcohol. I decide whether I smoke cigarettes. And in contemporary United States, we assume, we take it for granted that each person owns his or her own body. We take that for granted. However, that is not a universal assumption. There are women in the Middle East who do not control their own bodies. They essentially are property of their husband or the father. There are children being sold into slavery today in this world. They do not have control over their bodies. The tsunami that the world has just experienced has brought this issue to light. There are a lot of children who are now orphaned because their parents were killed by the floodwaters. And sadly, there are other adults collecting these children so they can use them in prostitution, child prostitution rings. So until the people around you respect your body as property, it is difficult for you to exercise any of your rights. The people in China have a right to life. The difference is that the government of China does not respect that right. And from that point of view, the Constitution does not apply only to people who live in the United States. The Constitution embodies human rights, individual rights that apply to anyone. The difference is that the government of the United States at least pretends that we have those rights and is supposed to respect those rights. Now, the most important concept about the Constitution is property. There is a one-word answer for every question about the Constitution, and that word is property. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect your life, your liberty, and your private property. This concept is so important that John Adams, the 12th President of the United States, right after George Washington, said, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the law of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, then anarchy and tyranny commence." I don't know what your personal religious beliefs are. However, if the law of property is as sacred as the law of God, you have to admit that it's going to factor heavily into the equation. Property is a concept that transcends cultures. It transcends languages, religions. Everyone in the world understands property. If you and I go to France, and we're sitting in a small bistro in France, and when nobody's looking, you reach over and take someone's croissant. When they come back and start screaming at you in French, even if you don't understand the language, you get the gist of the problem. You don't have to know the local laws to understand that taking someone's property is generally frowned upon. The idea of property is very, very simple. In fact, the idea of property is so simple that even a 2-year-old understands the concept of property. What is a 2-year-old's favorite word? Mine. Mine. This is mine. I want it to be mine. Why does a 2-year-old want everything to be mine? Because if you own it, if it is your property, then you control the disposition of it. You decide whether you're going to throw it across the room or hide it under the couch from Mom. Now, admittedly, 2-year-olds do not understand the concept of yours. And as adults, we are constantly trying to teach them the difference. These are your toys. You can play with your toys, but these are Tommy's toys. You can't play with Tommy's toys without getting permission. And so anytime you start to ask a question of who has the right to, the first question that you should ask is, who is the owner? Who owns the property? Once you understand who the property owner is, then you have answered all of the questions about rights. Now, the United States government has not been respecting our property. The problem that I have is that the United States government is attempting in oh so many ways to deprive you of your private property. And this is a process that has been going on for a long time. On page 10, I have a quote from another American president, Teddy Roosevelt, who became president in 1900, said, "Every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it." Does that sound like an American president who respects your private property? Is it really your private property if your neighbors can vote and take that property away from you? If your neighbors can vote and say, no, you are not allowed to use your property in a certain way? Does that support the concept of private property, or does it negate the whole idea of private property? Unfortunately, Teddy Roosevelt was a socialist. If you believe that the community can control in an individual's property, that is the idea behind socialism. And many of our presidents and the United States government in general is working frequently to take your property. How many people have heard the term eminent domain? Eminent domain is this idea where the government can come in and take your private property and use it for something else, for the greater good. And we are going to talk about how that concept violates individual rights. But the government is now controlling more and more of our property. The problem is that you do not own property the way that you think you do. If you own land, if you have a home, you think that you own that property. However, if you go out into the backyard and start to erect an oil derrick, would you be surprised if the sheriff came and knocked on the door and said, hey, you're not allowed to do that? You can't drill for oil on your land. Well, if you can drill for oil, we commonly understand that to be, that you have the mineral rights. Well, if you have the mineral rights to the land, then you own that land in a allodial title. And you own the land the way that you think you do. If you don't have a allodial title and you have used a real estate agent, real estate is the property on the land. You may own the grass, the bushes, the home, the trees, but you don't own the mineral rights. You are essentially renting that land for a number of years for the privilege of putting your house on that land.